ahead and start now. So I'd like to, first of all, thank everyone for joining us today. It's wonderful to see so many new faces. And as GRN continues to grow and develop, these book talks are a way for us to further the values and mission of the GRN by sharing with you books grounded in theories and methods that echo GRN's mission. We hope these titles will enrich your syllabi, literature reviews, and research. Today we present postcolonial thought and social theory to you because it offers an interdisciplinary, or what Dr. Go refers to as a transdisciplinary approach to understanding multiple social realities. Second, it highlights the importance of social positions. And third, it offers a way to tell a better story to create new and better social knowledge. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have to say that when I first read your book, it was with the same enthusiasm and excitement as when I read Edward Said's Orientalism as a young graduate student studying literary theory in the Department of English at Stanford. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our audience. Julian Go explores the social logics of imperial formations and modern colonialism, post-colonial, decolonial thought, and related questions of social theory, epistemology and knowledge, and global historical sociology. Much of Go's work focused on U.S. empire, resulting in articles and books such as The American Colonial State of the Philippines, Global Perspectives, American Empire and Politics of Meaning, The Patterns of Empire, and American Empire's 1688 to the Present. His other works on post-colonial thought and theory culminated in his book, Postcolonial Theory and Social Theory. His co-authored books include Fielding Transnationalism, Global Historical Sociology. He has been honored by winning prizes from the American Sociological Association, the Eastern Sociological Society, and the American Political Science Association, as well as the International Studies Association. His current projects include The History of Imperialism, Impact upon Police Militarization in the US, the UK, and France. He also continues to explore the implications of post-colonial, decolonial Southern theory upon social scientific knowledge. Post-colonial thought and social theory is a sweeping codex that masterfully presents first-wave thinkers like Franz Fanon and second-wave thinkers like Edward Said and Homi Bhabha, and extensively weaves in threads from feminist theory and Southern theory to approach a third wave of post-colonial thought. One of the wonderful things about this book is its emphasis on positionality, socially structured position, and standpoint theory. So my first question for today is, what inspired you to write this book? And how did your positionality play a role in the process?
Great. First of all, if I can just thank Anisa and the GRN for taking the time to host me. This is a fantastic opportunity for me to meet with and chat with new people. So I'm deeply honored. So thank you. Regarding the question, I tell a little bit of this in the preface. So for those of you who haven't seen the book, you can see the preface, which tells a little bit of the story of how I came to this book. And the short of it is, I began thinking about this book over 20 years ago, in fact, when I first started in graduate school as a PhD student in sociology at the University of Chicago. And I had been drawn to sociology because of its critical focus on the world. One of the things I discovered when I started getting into graduate school and the curriculum was a notorious absence in social science. And that absence was the absence of any serious consideration of the history and legacies of empire and colonialism, not only upon metropolitan centers like the United States, but also upon knowledge itself and upon social scientific knowledge. And I had long been interested in questions of empire and colonialism. And while I do think positionality is important, it did play a role, although, I'm always hesitant to reduce everything to positionality. I think we can talk more about this, but positionality is important. It is also can be oftentimes merely an aperture for solipsism. So I want to avoid that. But I will say, one of the things that drew me to the themes of this book is precisely, being a child of immigrants from the Philippines to the United States, and having long had a sense of American imperialism in the Philippines, but then recognizing and seeing how American sociology, and I would say European sociology as well, completely occluded any understanding, any recognition of the legacies of empire and colonialism upon the world. I mean, social science purports to study society. And what I had come to see is that you can't understand society without understanding the history of empire and colonialism. And yet most social science, this was in the 90s, most social science had completely ignored empire and colonialism. One body of thought that did take empire and colonialism very seriously was postcolonial thought, or what I'm calling post-colonial thought, and we can go into that more if you like. But this was a body of theory that was more so outside the social sciences. It was more so in the humanities. It traced its lineage, or I would trace its lineage, to the anti-colonial thinkers and movements of the mid-20th century. And so, while I was positioned in social science, I was very much interested in this body of thought. And so, I began thinking about how social science and post-colonial thinking could mutually collaborate in a sense. But it's taken me this long to actually write this book for various reasons. But it actually begins with this interest in empire and colonialism long ago, and yet this recognition that my discipline and adjacent disciplines had yet to take seriously empire and colonialism. There's a much longer story we could tell, but that's how I would answer that. And my positionality here, I think, does come in as again, as I mentioned, someone who's interested in becoming a scholar, but who was not your typical scholar. This was in the 90s, and I think the non-white, Asian or African or Caribbean, African-American scholars had just begun to be sort of entering the academy. And there was, a sense that there is a changing demographics in the American Academy, and yet social science hadn't really caught up and reckoned with that. It was still tied to sort of the white-dominated modes of thinking, and by white-dominated I mean imperialistic modes of thinking. And so my positionality certainly plays a role in that. And of course, many of the thinkers that I discuss, and many of the thinkers who articulate postcolonial theory, whether it be Franz Fanon, W.E.B. Du Bois, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Dipesh Chakrabarti, they all have sort of similar positionalities, which essentially we can think of as emerging from the margins, right? And of course, relative margins, right? As academics, the second wave of thinkers like Said and Bhabha, of course, were not marginalized in society, but within the academy, right? Many of us begin as marginalized, and if only in the sense that many of the concerns and interests we have in empire and colonialism were not being discussed in our discipline.
Follow up on what you had said about post-colonial thought. For me, I came from the background of studying post-colonial thought as a literary theory major. And then going over to the social sciences, I was surprised. There was this utter lack of identifying that perhaps a colonial past might have some type of implication on the research that we were doing. Could you speak a little bit more on how you weaved in post-colonial thought into your book and into how it can be a very valuable tool to social scientists and to people working interdisciplinarily?
I think there's a couple of different ways in which I've tried to incorporate post-colonial thinking into the social sciences. The first way is to, again, as I said, take seriously empire and colonialism and its legacies. And look, I can't underestimate the importance of empire and colonialism enough, right? This world of nation states that we live in is a very recent invention, right? I would argue that it really wasn't until the 1960s that the world that we exist, which consists of nominally sovereign independent states, that was really only the dominant mode of organizing human societies in the past 50 or 60 years. Before that, the entire history of human society was organized in terms of empires and colonialism. The vast majority of the world has either been an imperial power or a colony, right? We can think of very few examples of places that had not either been an imperial power or a colony. And so this is a crucially important fact of our history. And again, I think post-colonial thought helps us remind us of that. And when thinking about social science, one of the ways that we have to incorporate that fact is to consider two things. First of all, how the legacies of colonialism and empire continue to shape our societies, whether it has to do with race relations, whether it has to do with economic relations. But also, secondly, and this is where it really, I think, this is where the post-colonial theory and the humanities comes in, but also in terms of how empire and colonialism has shaped our very culture and our thinking, right? Including the social sciences. And when you look at the history of social sciences, what you find is that the social sciences was born in, of, and for imperial metropoles. In the late 1900s, in the late 1800s and the early 20th century is when disciplinary social science, as we know it, was founded, at least in the United States. And this was at the same time that the United States and the rest of the European powers were stepping up their imperial interventions around the world. And sociology, in many ways, represented the thought or the mode of thought that the empires themselves encapsulated in their practices. And so, there's a long legacy of sociology being a kind of mode of representation for imperial thought. And so one of the things that one of the ways in which I think post-colonial theories needs to be brought into the social sciences is to critique that history of imperialism and its legacies upon social thought in particular, right? How are the ways in which we think as social scientists about the world and we analyze, how are the theories and concepts that we use as social scientists colored by or compromised by or limited by their sort of imperial provenance, their colonial origins. And so one of the ways in which, in short, post-colonial theory needs to be brought into social sciences is as a critique, right? As a constant interrogation of the categories and theories and practices that social scientists engage in. And the other way is to question, this is related, to question the standpoint of social sciences, right? So when I say that social sciences or sociology was born in, of, and for empire, and that it carries its legacy, what I'm suggesting is that we need to recognize sociology, in this case, and social theory as itself a mode of thought that is reflective of the interests and concerns and experiences of imperial powers and elites in the imperial metropoles. And that's what sociology really emerged as, right? It was a way for mostly white elites in the early 20th century in the United States to think about and manage the social problem, to manage threats from immigrants, to try to establish what it called social order, but it was really a code word for establishing a white-dominated order. And so the whole standpoint of social science, I think, has emerged from the standpoint of power, from the standpoint of the imperial metropoles. And I would argue that this has shaped not everything, but a lot of social science categories, a lot of social science ways of thinking, not least it's sort of Eurocentrism.
Yeah, and this really does segue into the next question. The book is concerned with, can the subaltern speak? How can the global south speak and share their perspectives? Essentially, how can a different reality be perceived? In the sciences, they use mathematics to convey and depict and share new theories and new concepts. Numbers are the language they employ to tell stories, see things in a new perspective, and to essentially see new realities. You share a very demonstrative story in the book that illustrates what you've just mentioned about colonialism, based on social positionality colonial perspectives is the experience of the French colonial administrator Albert Surratt and social philosopher Franz Fanon. Could you share that story with us in the context of social positionality and how it informs your book?
Yeah, thank you. So, in the book, there's a moment where I discuss Surratt, who was a colonial administrator in Algeria. And Surratt, of course, heralded French colonialism in Algeria as a civilizing process, a benign colonialism that was beneficial to Algerians. And you can contrast that with Fanon, who was also, although he originated in the Caribbean, was also in Algeria around the time. And Fanon, who criticized colonialism for being brutal and inhumane. Now, when we, as either just everyday thinking people or as social scientists, would look at this contrast between Surratt's views and Fanon's views, we would easily say, of course, that's because Surratt was a colonial administrator. They had an interest in saying that French colonialism was benign and beneficial. And also, we might say, if we apply a sociology of knowledge to what he's saying, we might say, well, he's of course in a position of power, so he doesn't see really all the brutality on the ground. He doesn't see the exploitation on the ground, whereas Fanon on the ground is seeing those things. And so what you have are two different perspectives, and they are they're colored by the positionality of the two. And not so much, I would argue, not so much the individual positionality, but their social location, that is their location within a social hierarchy. So again, I don't want to reduce this to individuals. I would rather see Surratt on the one hand and Fanon on the other as representing different social groups, right? The standpoint of power versus the standpoint of relative marginality. And what I've been arguing and suggesting, and what I talk more about in the book, and others have talked about this too, is that the standpoint of power is the standpoint of social science, and social science emerges from the standpoint of power. And so one of the challenges and one of the lessons we can learn from postcolonial theory is to try to incorporate the standpoint of the marginalized, right? The standpoint that Fanon offered, the standpoint that colonized peoples offer, and how that might then help us rethink how to do sociology, how to rethink social sciences, might introduce new concepts, new forms of knowledge that we can engage in. Part of the problem with dominant social science and its imperial standpoint is that it has long occluded or repressed those possible alternative knowledges. Right? Those knowledges get marginalized as unscientific. They get marginalized as representative of bias, of subjective, right? Without, of course, understanding how their own position is rooted in particular subjective positions as well. And so, one of the ways in which postcolonial thinking can help us transform social sciences and overcome, I think, what are really blinders or biases in the way social scientists think is by making us more attentive to these alternative modes of thought and knowledge. Now, I don't want to be a relativist, right? I'm not saying that there's no objective knowledge. And in fact, in the book, I talk about how that position is a problematic one, and this choice between purely objective science and sort of subjective bias that's presumably represented by marginalized knowledges. That's a false choice. It's a false binary. That in fact there's multiple objectivities, right? And I drew a lot from feminist philosophers of science for this, right? Who have long pointed out how the realities that social science describes are in many ways only partial representations, and that other representations need to be offered, and that the women's standpoint, or which is an oppressed standpoint, offers the beginning for insights into an alternative modes of knowledge. And lastly, this is why I also in the book talk not just about Fanon, but I mentioned someone, a white male sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, who was writing in France and who I suggest offered similar thoughts to Fanon. They had a lot of disagreements, but offered similar thoughts, despite the fact that Bourdieu was a Parisian academic. And I argue that this is because Bourdieu himself adopted the standpoint of the colonized in Algeria. His early work in Algeria was rooted in the concerns and experiences of Algerians who were subjected to colonial rule. So Bourdieu's early work, for those of you who are social scientists will know this, his early work was very much rooted in the standpoint of the subaltern subjects in Algeria. And that's why I think he was able to actually craft an alternative way of understanding Algerian society that is not unlike the way Fanon or post-colonial thinkers did. I would argue that Bourdieu is kind of an early post-colonial social scientist. And I bring this example because I don't, one of the things I'm hesitant of is a tendency to essentialize and to say that if you are an individual who is white or from the global north, you can't, your knowledge is interminably biased. Right? This is not, to me, a tenable position. So that gets at something of, I think, Anisa, your questions, hopefully.
No, it's true. And I'm really glad you did bring up, you emphasize on this essential, that it's the social position. Because someone can occupy multiple social positions, and in the book you do use it as a way to, as a mechanism for people from different walks of life to connect and understand, as you just mentioned, someone who's coming from Paris who you wouldn't think would share the same type of understanding of the world, and I think that's came out very, very clearly in the book. Really, if you should really read this book, I highly recommend it because the argument is so masterful and it's written so well, and how Julian sets up these arguments, he answers every question that you could possibly think of in relation to post-colonial thought and why this should be incorporated into the social sciences. And the next question that I have really is in line with this last answer he had. You take the theory of Robert Young in this concept of making the invisible visible, and it does go, and you use this idea of maps, and maps as this visual trope to illustrate that if one map cannot possibly depict the entire world, neither can one theory explain everything. Could you share with us how you use this concept of map in a way to convey how particular knowledge of the world is captured in multiple theoretical truths?
Thank you. Yeah, the map analogy is really something that I find very useful, and I've found it from certain philosophers of science. And one of the things I try to convey in the book is that this notion of different standpoints and that of people offering different possibilities for different knowledges depending upon social location, that this sounds to some people as unscientific. It sounds to some people as not allowing for objective truth, as something being relativistic. But what's interesting is if you read philosophers of science and people who know something about science, and many of you probably are natural scientists, you'll understand that in fact, at least some of them recognize this idea of multiple knowledges and different knowledges and different positionalities creating different knowledges. And the map analogy comes from one such philosopher, Ronald Gere, who articulates this idea of scientific perspectivalism, where he says, even in the natural sciences, there's a notion that our theories can't capture everything, and that it's all knowledge is at once partial and subjective and objective at the same time, right? That knowledge is always embedded in particular standpoints or from particular perspectives, but it's also can be objective at the same time. And maps is a good example, right? So if I am walking, I'm here in Chicago, if I'm trying to understand Chicago, I can offer a map of it, but what map I offer will be shaped by my particular standpoint, my position in the city, and it will only offer a partial representation, but it will still be true. It will still be objectively true. So I can offer you a walking map, a street map of Chicago, And that will be objectively true. Well, you can follow the map and you can walk down the streets and it corresponds to your experience. But it doesn't capture everything about Chicago, right? That map can't capture, say, the buildings. It can't capture the subway system, right? In order for a map to capture the subway system, what do I have to do? I have to adopt a different position. I have to go down to the subway and map out the whole subway line by riding the subway from a different position. And then I could come up with a map of the subway, right? Which offers a way of looking at Chicago as well. And that will also be objectively true, but also be partial, right? Because it won't let us see the streets, right? And so on and so on and so on. And so as Gear points out, scientific knowledge is exactly like this. It's maps, right? Any theory, any representation that we call science, scientific knowledge is always a selective representation that is rooted in positions and is at once subjective and objective at the same time. And that's science, right? That is science itself. And you can never have an entire map of Chicago that represents everything about Chicago, right? It would be impossible. If you have a map from the standpoint of the streets, you're going to miss the subway. And then if you have a map of the subway, you're going to miss the streets or the sewer lines or the electrical lines. There's no such thing as a full map of Chicago except Chicago itself, right? Which is no longer than a representation. So all knowledge has this characteristic of being like a map. And the argument about postcolonial theory or the critique that postcolonial theory offers is to help us recognize that traditional social science only offers a limited set of maps, right, from particular standpoints that then occlude other things about the world. Whereas alternative standpoints, whether it be from the marginalized or particular groups within the marginalized, can offer different maps based upon their different standpoints that embed different types of experiences. And those maps can be objective and scientifically true as much as dominant social science can be. And that the trick is to allow room for those alternative perspectives. The problem is that dominant social science takes its own particular subjective and objective map as the only way to represent the world. It masquerades its parochiality, its provinciality, its partiality as something that is universal, right? It doesn't acknowledge its own partiality. Once it acknowledges its own partiality, then that allows room for these other voices and knowledges to be let in. The problem is so much dominant sociology, for various reasons, doesn't recognize its own partiality.
Thank you. Now, for my last question, before I open up the floor for your questions, so be thinking, or please feel free to use the chat box to submit your questions. So my last question is, the book builds up to introducing what you term postcolonial perspective of realism. Now, how does the postcolonial perspective of realism enables the ability to tell a bigger story, or to create what you say is a new and better knowledge?
The idea of a postcolonial perspectival realism, I know, is a mouthful. And sounds
did I pronounce that properly?
But I would emphasize two things in that statement. One is the realism, and this is where I'm getting at. The realism in the sense of, again, I'm trying. This accusation that's typically leveled at the kind of thought that gets associated with postcolonial theory. The accusation that it's sort of non-scientific, that it's subjective, that it's biased. I think this needs to be resisted at all costs, and I think that there are epistemic warrants for resisting that. Hence, the emphasis on realism, right? Postcolonial perspectival realism is trying to get at, this is not a kind of what used to be called a postmodern, fancy that doesn't believe in the real. So I believe this alternative perspective, postcolonial perspectival realism, is capturing the real in certain ways. So that's why I emphasize realism. But it's perspectival, right? In the sense I mentioned before, it's cognizant of its own particular perspective and how it offers particular insights on the world. And it's postcolonial in that not only does it take this questions of knowledge seriously, but it also is operating from the assumption that knowledge has traditionally been monopolized by these conventional standpoint of imperial power. And so it's a critical form of knowledge as well. And again, my hope for social science is that if it does take post-colonial theory seriously, then it does allow for more maps to be produced, because for too long we have been living with a narrow set of social maps, a narrow set of maps of the world, and there are many more maps that we need to bring in to enrich our social knowledge. And they have for too long been oppressed under the guise of them being subjective or biased or some other claim. And so a post-colonial perspectival realism, in my view, is a sort of mantra, my mantra for social science, right? That we take seriously empire and colonialism, that we understand its impact upon knowledge. We understand the importance of standpoints in shaping knowledges, and we allow room for other voices to be brought in. And again, these voices are different theories, different ways, different concepts for capturing the social reality around us that offer an alternative to the dominant standpoint, and that originate from not the standpoint of power, but the concerns and experiences of people on the ground, concerns and experiences of actually the vast majority of the population of the world who have been subjected to the exploitation and domination of colonialism. And the problem, of course, the social scientist represents the interests and experiences of a very narrow set of human beings in the world. So my call for a post-colonial perspectival realism is also a call to globalize social science and hence globalize knowledge in a way. I'm not suggesting that it's an easy thing to do, and there's all kinds of difficulties and problems and all kinds of questions, but it is a call that I think needs to be made. I'm not unique in making this call, many others also, and what I offer in this book is one way of thinking about how to advance and fulfill this promise, this call for a more global set of knowledges. And it's one option among others, I think.
I'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, you can either raise your hand or unmute yourself.
So thank you very much for this talk. I haven't read the book yet, so forgive my questions too self-evident. But
I'm sorry. Can you introduce yourself and let us know who you are, just very briefly, if you can? I'd like to get to know who you are.
Sure. So I'm Daniela. I'm based now in Vienna. I come from Latin America and I study Asia.
Okay.
So I'd like to think of myself as an earthling. What I wanted to ask you is something I hear time and time again, is the post-colonial thought is doing critique and critique only. When are they going to get over it, go beyond it, and do something, construct something? And I was wondering, what are your thoughts or what are your reactions to that kind of posture? So I'm now a PhD student, a very young scholar, and it's sometimes really tiresome to kind of like defend that it's not just critique and that there is a lot. Yeah. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and how your book perhaps relates to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. It's a really important question. And that's certainly one of the things behind this book, which is to go beyond just the critique and think about how it can be productive. And in my case, productive for social science and sociology in particular. And I think maybe part of the answer lies in the things I've been saying about maps and alternative knowledges. And that, you know, my argument would be that post-colonial theory can be productive by opening up these spaces for alternative knowledges. And, you know, what I try to do in the book is give some examples, because there have been or sort of inroads in our knowledge that we kind of take for granted, but I would argue originate precisely from this sort of implicit post-colonial methodology that I'm suggesting. And a clear example is W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, in many ways, in the early 20th century, was writing in opposition to dominant white sociology at the time, right? White dominant sociology at the time was talking about the so-called Negro problem in the United States. It was buying into a lot of the racial tropes and it was embedding it in his knowledge. And Du Bois offered exactly this kind of subaltern standpoint based upon his own experiences and concerns and based upon research in African-American communities and his knowledge of slavery and the history of African Americans. He was able to actually produce one of the first, if not the first, understanding of race as socially constructed, right? The idea that race is not a biological reality, but socially constructed in many ways, at least in American social science, can be traced to Du Bois and his sort of what I would be calling his alternative map making based upon his positionality and based upon taking the experiences and concerns of oppressed peoples seriously. And he was able to then show that dominant sociology was wrong in its assumption that there's these biological essences. Now, some people say it was other thinkers who brought this up, but I think when you really look at the history, Du Bois was among the first. And of course, we take this for granted today, social construction of knowledge, but the idea, social construction of race, but the idea of race as socially constructed is, I would argue, a product of exactly post-colonial thought, a post-colonial methodology. And so what that means for us today is to, when we do our research and we do our thinking, is to be careful about what I call metrocentrism. This is the tendency to take the categories and theories that have been applied from the dominant perspective, from the dominant imperial metropole, and just to apply them to everything and everywhere around the world. And that what we need to do is, get back to this basic, I think, social scientific principle of research, which is to think harder about sort of grounded theory and inductive research, and to base our studies and our analyses on the experiences and concerns of the communities that we're studying, rather than starting from the top down, right? And I think this is very much a post-colonial approach. And what you can get is exactly, I would think, the kind of new knowledges, such as the kind that Du Bois offered. And I can give many more examples. I think Fanon offered a unique theory of how colonial domination works and how race in the colonial context works, and so on and so on. But I think that what these are examples exactly of post-colonial theory being productive. And go ahead and tell the critics that in fact, much of the knowledge that they think they have from dominant social sciences actually comes from the marginalized perspective. The last example is Marx himself, who in many ways was, I think he's subject to the post-colonial critique, but relationally was a marginalized thinker. And by analyzing capitalism from the standpoint of the factory and from the standpoint of the worker, he was able to construct an entirely new theory of capitalism, right? But it's rooted in this particular standpoint. And again, I think that's very much a post-colonial method, or it's akin to the kind of post-colonial approach that I have learned from post-colonial theory. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you.
We have our next question from Khalid.
Thank you very much. My name is Khalid, and I am an Iranian Kurd. I study PhD in public international law and legal philosophy. My question is also about, it's very similar to Daniela's question, but it's about the construction of self and other. Well, it's how we could overcome this construction of self and other if we can't construct ourselves without engaging with what already exists as a literature. For example, how we could construct ourselves without deconstructing what the mainstreams constructed as. So why we should be engaged with a fake identity rather than focusing on who we are, how we want to construct ourselves, then engaging with the mainstream. Because as a post-colonialist, the problem which I have with the post-colonialists is that they engage with the mainstream through the third party. For example, it's a critique of Marxism. It's a critique of other critics of the mainstream. So they are not engaging with the mainstream directly if we really want to look at it. So why we shouldn't just say, okay, so close your eyes, nothing exists. How do you want to define yourself? Then engage with the mainstream. Otherwise, it is, if we go for the Fanon and Homi Bhabha, the way that I looked at them, it's really an institutionalization of a colonialism. Why? Because they can't go beyond the concepts which has been produced by the mainstream thinkers. The way that I, as a human political activist, I was a medical student 20 years ago when I was kicked out of the country. And I realized when I came here and engaged with the literature and changed everything, I realized that the way I was thinking about the rights, I was institutionalizing or reforming the idea of the colonialism within the state without being aware of it. Why? Because I was looking at myself through the lens of a Western philosophy rather than who am I apart from that. So what is the alternative? How we could overcome these structural barriers, because it's not about it's not about the knowledge, it's about the structure that shapes the knowledge.
Thank you for that. That's a very, I think, rich and important question. I'll try to answer it from my limited knowledge of sort of what you're trying to get at. And I guess my own view is that this desire to construct a self or to have an alternative knowledge that is completely outside the dominant, or what you're calling mainstream, I think that is impossible, right? And I think that that's exactly why post-colonial theorists did engage with the mainstream, is because there's really no alternative, right? Fanon, when he came up with his ideas, it didn't come from a pure space of indigeneity, right? It was always an engagement with his Western training, his European training. And from that engagement, from that dialogue can come alternative and new knowledges. But it's always in engagement with the dominant. And so I guess this may not be exactly what you're getting at, but to me, the idea of thinking outside the dominant discourses is impossible, right? And this is what, I think if you read the Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, this is exactly his point, that you can't think outside of the categories that have been bequeathed to us. And many of those are dominant categories. What you can do is critique and work within those categories and use those categories to maybe open up alternative spaces. So when I talk about, Du Bois, for example, providing alternative knowledge, that alternative knowledge comes from his embeddedness in the experiences and concerns of those communities, but those experiences and concerns are themselves already in dialogue with, in relation with, already sort of almost hegemonized by the dominant discourses. And the trick is to pry open alternative spaces in engagement and in dialogue. So I guess the idea of a pure outside, to me, is not quite the thing that I'd be searching for, right? And I think that I'm on the side of Chakrabarty, who says, it's impossible, but indispensable. But it's both impossible and indispensable to think with social science, by which he means it's impossible to think outside social science, but it's indispensable to think with it. That is, knowledge always has to be an engagement, and it has to be part of a critique. So it's a very important question, and I think that maybe philosophers or in philosophy might have a different approach, because I know in philosophy there's been attempts to come up with a sort of Africana philosophy or some alternative mode of thinking, which is purely indigenous or alternative. I just don't see that as a historical reality, because any attempt to even claim what is indigenous or not is already implicitly in relation to a dominant discourse. So I think there's no outside, right? There's no pure outside.
The question also, the third question that I asked when I framed it about you, it really is how can this alternative speak? How can the global self speak? This has always been kind of this reoccurring theme throughout post-colonial thought. And I had mentioned how in sciences, they use math. They use mathematics. Einstein used mathematics, Bohr used mathematics as a way to share this new vision of reality. It's very hard in the science, in the social sciences and the humanities to really disengage and try to provide a different reality or a framework or a structure to come into. And you mentioned a little bit about in your book about changing the structure, the structure that was created by colonialism that we're now deeply entrenched in, whether it's in our daily lives or within the academia and social sciences. We don't have that tool of math of being able to describe this. So it is very difficult, and it's true how it is a reoccurring question that postcolonial theorists think about. But right now we're not in a place to, and I think this is where the idea of maps come in very well, where you provide that additional map, that inlay into maps. I use maps a lot in my work as just as a graphic explanation of why we need to talk about different perspectives, because they are different perspectives, and there will always be different perspectives. And now I think what you're calling for is that every perspective be given relevance, is given respect, and that is allowed to be part of whatever canon that's part of the discussion.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to do is maybe differentiate between levels of perspectives and knowledges, right? So we can talk about different perspectives as being sort of mathematics as a perspective of the world versus social science as a perspective of the world. So we can think about it in terms of different disciplines. We can think about it in terms of different representations. Textual representations offer a certain way of thinking about the world versus formulas, which is also textual to a certain degree. And so when I call for a post-colonial social science, I am really, betraying my commitment to social science. that this is not about providing a completely alternative mode of knowledge, like poetry, which offers a certain form of knowledge. That's not the kind of, when I say alternative knowledges, I'm really talking about alternative knowledges within the confines of social science. So Khalid, this gets back to your point. Like, I'm not trying to get outside social science. And that's not my critique at all. Social science is both indispensable and problematic, right? And I can't think outside social science. And so by alternative knowledges within social science, I mean, things like alternative concepts, alternative theories within social science, not necessarily a completely different way of, a completely different epistemic mode or a completely different alternative. And even within social science, we can think about different modes of representation, right? So W.E.B. Du Bois, right, offered new concepts, and he wrote in a very prose-like manner, which is a lot of social scientists don't see as will find very difficult. But he also offered these amazing maps. Not the maps in the metaphorical sense I was talking about earlier, but literal maps, graphic representations, which you could also say could be incorporated in social science. But these are different representations, alternative representations. But I'm also interested in alternative concepts and theories, because I think that the very concepts that we use to make sense of the world have a history. And many of the dominant ones have an imperial history. And so what alternative concepts and theories can we have? That's really, for me, the challenge of a post-colonial social science. So it's not about rejecting social science completely.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Nikki.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I'm a student at Boston University. And I wanted to ask you, Professor Go, it's quite a simple question, but it's something I'm very curious about. What gave you the courage to pursue this book? I mean, it's obviously quite a large undertaking. And you mentioned that in the initial stages of it, you were kind of at the margins in academia. So can you share about the journey that you went on in creating the book and what made you take the leap, I guess?
That's a very good question. And again, I don't want to be solipsistic about this, but I do think that there's larger lessons to my experience with this book and with academia. I mean, in many ways, when I started thinking about merging post-colonial social science as a graduate student, the initial reaction from my mentors and the institution of sociology and journalism was like, that's not a good idea. Even post-colonial theorists I talked to, were suggesting that it's not a good idea. And so I did table it a little bit for a while. And instead, I did a project on empire and colonialism and American empire and colonialism, which was itself at the time completely new in sociology, right? In the 1990s, I'm talking about American empire. And unlike today, that was a notion that was very unfamiliar to most scholars. And I was working in the subfield called historical sociology, where historical sociology didn't mean that you looked at empire and colonialism. So I actually took on empire and colonialism as a study, and then later was able to come back to some of the more themes of this book, which I think that I don't think I would have been able to write this book as a junior scholar, for example. I think it would have been too challenging. So I don't think I'm that brave, because the short answer is I got tenure and I was able to take on more challenges. But it is, I think, it is always a risk when you try to critique your discipline and try to create something new. And where did I get that spirit? I don't really know. I think that it's actually just a further version of, I think, what I would think is the spirit of scholarship in general, which is always to critique and always to grope for more and push for more. And so I don't think it's anything special in that sense. I think it's another logical sequence in the ethos of scholarship and what I think scholars should be doing always, which is critiquing and pushing and pushing for more. But thank you for that, Nikki.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, particularly Professor Go. Thank you so much for this wonderful book and for joining us. And again, if any of you are interested in hosting a book talk of our members, there's a book that you're passionate about and you would like to bring to our network, please feel free to contact me either through my email that you can find on our webpage or through the emailing mechanism on the website. Again, thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you next month.
Sorry, can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Can I just say one thing? Yeah, I just want to thank you for having me and thank everyone for listening. And it was nice to see some of you and chat with all of you.
Thank you. That is very generous of you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.